Section 15 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 12. The Early Reformation Abroad, the Divorce, Fall of Woolsey, 1521 to 1530, Part 1. The time was now at hand when differences on religion, which had for many years only slightly influenced English state affairs, were to become all-powerful both in changing the character of the nation and in breaking up society into new party combinations. England was to recall all the memories of former struggle with the popes, and to consolidate them into a system of permanent revolt. The existing laws against papal encroachment were neither few nor unimportant. The constitutions of Clarendon, 1164, as long as they were in force, had prohibited appeals to Rome without the royal consent. Edward I's outlawry of the clergy and the execution of Archbishop Scrope in 1405 had proved that priests were not inviolable, and of the three great statutes of Richard II, that of Mortmain, 1391, limited the Church's power of acquiring property; that of Provisors, 1390, protected our benefices from being filled up by the Pope; and that of Praemunire, 1393, vindicated the power of the state to exclude bulls. Moreover, a statute of 1395 forbade the exercise in England of any jurisdiction derogatory to the kings. England, too, was inclined to the anti-papal party on the Continent, and had been represented at the Council of Constance, which exercised the power of deposing popes, by no means, however, endorsing its act in murdering John Huss, the disciple of her own Wycliffe, as was shown by the already noticed escape from a furious London mob of the Emperor Sigismund, who had given and broken Huss's safe conduct. After this, English opposition to papal claims had flagged for a time. France had sided with the reforming Council of Basel in 1431, and this had been thought a sufficient reason for our taking the other side. Thus was shown the inherent weakness of a mere political opposition in religious matters. It was liable at any moment to collapse, because while the papal practice was unvarying, the ebbs and flows of state affairs were constantly suggesting fresh combinations, which made the help of Rome desirable, and therefore induced kings to purchase it by concessions and by starving church reform in the manner described in Chapter 6. Public fury might be aroused for a while by some instance of clerical exaction or immorality, but when the burst of feeling had spent itself, things were apt to settle down into just their former condition. There was as yet no deep-seated and burning persuasion that such evils sprang from a root of falsehood, and would end only when its last fibres were torn from the soil. Fortunately for the world, however, some of the best intellects living had now for years been concentrating themselves on religious thought. The simple goodness of John Huss had naturally made a deep impression, which was increased by the unparalleled infamy of his murder, and at the end of the 15th century his disciples, under the name of the Brothers of Unity, still formed 200 churches in Bohemia. In 1489 this body decided that if God anywhere raised up faithful doctors and reformers of the Church, they for their part would make common cause with them, nor did they fail to keep their promise when the time came. Elsewhere, similar associations were formed on semi-Catholic principles, as in the Netherlands by the so-called Brothers of the Common Lot, to which belonged Thomas à Kempis, the celebrated author of The Imitation of Christ. These good men lived together in voluntary communities without vows, and devoted themselves to preaching, to the instruction of the young in Latin and Greek, and to the transcription and printing of books. They held that the Bible contains a sound and simple doctrine accessible to all, and evident of itself to any reader without great pains or learned controversy. It is therefore, they thought, open to all, and should not be forbidden, a doctrine which drew on them the strongest opposition from the mendicant friars, who were also aggrieved by their being only half monks and accepting the rule of no order. In England there were still relics here and there of an even exaggerated Lollardism, as in the 10 inhabitants of Tenterden who were summoned before Warham in 1511 for maintaining that the elements are mere bread and wine, rejecting baptism, holding confirmation and confession to be needless, and refusing extreme unction, pilgrimages, and saint worship. Sometimes eminent foreign teachers, though remaining in communion with the Church, aimed at nothing short of a revolution in theology. Such was John of Goch, who about the year 1470 boldly called Thomas Aquinas the prince of error, and was before Erasmus in maintaining that monastic vows were so far from indicating a higher religious standard that they are tolerable only as supports to those who cannot do their duty without them. With still greater boldness the celebrated Wessel, who died in 1481, had maintained that the treasure of good works has not been left to be distributed by papal indulgences on earth, since Scripture says of the dead that their works do follow them. He had also taught that the Fathers' interpretation of the Bible are not the work of the Holy Spirit, that the monastic state is not favourable to salvation, and that Christ has left no vice-regent on earth. All this shows us how open men's minds had long been to the notion of deeply seated church abuses, and how ready the world was for thinkers like Erasmus, especially for those of his works which simplified Bible interpretation. It is highly remarkable that the starting point of all wholesomer ideas of religion was both in England and abroad that preference for family over monastic life, which made Sir Thomas More's household what it was, which dictated, as we have seen, Collett's arrangements for the government of his school, and which formed so large a part of the teaching of Erasmus, Goch, Wessel, and Luther. It was not accident, but the very spirit of the time that made the young Luther in his cell at Erfurt dwell with such delight on the history of Hannah and Samuel, and declare that he wanted no more happiness than to be always reading of such fathers, mothers, and children. The notion being once conceived that the very ideal of holiness had been distorted in this main point, many farther steps were easy. Might not other church maxims be equally groundless, such, for instance, as the power of priestly absolution apart from real change and enlightenment of the soul? And above all, might it not be true that all the evils and superstitions of the Church had sprung from forgetfulness of the true old religion, that of enthusiasm, the religion of St. Paul and of Augustine, which looked for justification not in anything which we do or can do, but in faith only, a strong and converting faith, founded on denial of self and the acceptance of Christ's redemption. This and this alone Luther began to think could give value to the moral life by quickening and spiritualizing action. Our deeds are accepted not for anything in themselves, but in proportion as they express and, as it were, utter this faith. Hence all merely formal modes of obtaining God's favour appeared to Luther anti-Christian. Consequently, when in 1517 the Pope's agent Tetzel ventured to offer indulgences for sale close to his own parish of Wittenberg, he could not but make his celebrated protest, as Huss had done before him. For the theory of these documents was the very antithesis to that on which he considered all religion to be founded. According to them, something of the nature of a spiritual gift might be obtained without any spiritual condition whatever. They did not indeed profess to take away sin. This belonged to the power of the keys, which was different from that of indulgence. But they did assert that anyone in the outward communion of the Church might, by paying a small sum, and it was expressly said, without any other condition, obtain participation in all good works done by the Church militant, and also relief of departed souls from purgatory. By 1520, Luther, having much cleared and strengthened his views by the study of Greek, had farther come to maintain that both councils and fathers might err concerning doctrine, and was expressing his high admiration for Melanchthon, who denied transubstantiation and the sacerdotal theory. He also saw objections to the 7 sacraments of the Roman Church, and treated the Pope's infallibility as an arrogant pretension. In that year he also declared against auricular confession and the refusal of the cup to the laity, publishing in October his book on the Babylonish captivity of the Church, and on the 10th of December burned at the gate of Wittenberg the Pope's bull of condemnation. On April 19th, 1521, he appeared by the Emperor's command before the Diet of Worms, and declined to retract his theological opinions unless convinced out of the Bible, thus creating among the German princes a strong enthusiasm in his favour. He was indeed, by the single act of Charles, placed under the ban of the Empire, yet in spite of much pressure from those who wished to repeat the Constance tragedy by burning the new heretic and throwing his ashes into the Rhine, his safe conduct was not violated as that of Huss had been. A few weeks later the Elector of Saxony, his own sovereign, had no difficulty in arresting him collusively and concealing him in the safe retreat of the Wartburg, a castle close to Eisenach. Before the end of 1521, Henry VIII wrote his book on the 7 sacraments in answer to Luther's Babylonish captivity, and for this Pope Leo gave him the title of Defender of the Faith. The king, it seems, considered that the new doctrines were making their way in his own kingdom, and was thus stimulated to authorship. It is certain that Luther's works were read in Oxford and elsewhere at the time, for Archbishop Warham, as Chancellor, thought it necessary in the same year to order a search for them in the university. Similar inquiries were set on foot in the diocese of Hereford, and Bishop Fisher preached an anti-Lutheran sermon in St. Paul's, at which some German merchants had to do penance for eating meat on Friday. Henry uses against the heresiarch the customary arguments. Was it conceivable that not only Pope Leo, whose character was so high, but all other holy popes were in error when they enjoined indulgences? And was the Church to believe that so many teachers, by whom and at whose graves miracles had been done, should be after all in error as to the papal power, and that a mere Fraterculus was born to set them right? Considering the resemblance of these arguments to the after-reasonings of Sir Thomas More, there is no reason to doubt the statement that at least one illustrious convert was brought over to a belief in the Pope's supremacy by the very controversialist who was afterwards to behead him for retaining it. So far as it could be proved by zeal in controversy, Henry's orthodoxy may therefore be considered as beyond question. As he had fought for the Pope in the days of the Holy League, so he argued for him now. But all these fences and their strong array were to be scattered to the winds by one violent temptation. His wife, Queen Catherine, had for some time been distasteful to him from age and other reasons, and either the remembrance of the secret protest which his father had caused him to make against his betrothal in 1496, or some other evil suggestion brought to his mind the notion that his marriage had been unlawful from the first. It has been maintained that the first hint came in 1526 from the Bishop of Tarbes, who, in one of the manifold negotiations for the Princess Mary's marriage, had expressed some doubts of her legitimacy. It is not, however, uncharitable to say that dates prove passion and not policy to have suggested the notion. For from the time when the young and beautiful Anne Boleyn appeared at court in 1522 on her return from France, her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, had received a shower of honours and profitable employments, such as nothing but a strong fancy on the king's part for his daughter would be enough to account for. It is therefore superfluous to discuss Henry's alleged qualms of conscience as to his marriage, and his misgivings that God had warned him of its unlawfulness by the death of so many of his children in infancy. However strong and even sincere these may have become at last, their first origin is perfectly plain. Wolsey seems first to have realized the king's intentions in 1527, and the cardinal's manner of seconding them justly earned all the misfortunes which it afterwards brought upon him. He first advised Henry to put away Catherine by his own authority, giving as a reason that she had been married to Arthur in facie ecclesiae, and that after this no more could be said. She could not thenceforward be her brother-in-law's wife, all appearances notwithstanding. As the king thought this plan likely to fail, Wolsey next lent himself to a shameless mockery of law, collusively citing the king to appear before himself as legate and Warham, and to answer for his misdemeanour in cohabiting with his sister-in-law for 18 years. The idea seems to have been that this might be enough to make Catherine yield at once. As she never thought of such an act of weakness, the hypocritical procedure came to an end of itself, and it then became necessary to appeal to the Pope, since Catherine certainly would at last. It seemed, for many reasons, safe to do so, for such a supporter of the papacy as Henry would surely not be refused. Nor were precedents hard to find either abroad or at home. Both the daughters of Louis XI had been divorced, and in Scotland Henry's own sister had since 1526 been striving, not unsuccessfully, to be set free from her husband, Lord Angus, on the impudent plea that James IV was not killed at Flodden, but lived till after her second marriage. Moreover, the first nobleman at the English court, the Earl of Suffolk, had, as Mr. Brewer remarks, twice committed bigamy and been 3 times divorced, his first wife having been his aunt, and his last his daughter-in-law. With such instances full in view, what fear could there be of failure? But Wolsey had neglected to allow for the one decisive circumstance that Pope Clement had been taken prisoner by Charles's army just a month before Henry thought of applying to him, and that if he decided against the emperor's aunt, there was every chance of a second sack of Rome. The unhappy pontiff tried to gain time by twice sending dispensations which would not work, and it was only on a third embassy from England that something like an agreement was arrived at. In order that Wolsey might not bear the whole odium of the transaction, Cardinal Campeggio was to act as papal commissioner along with him. Even thus much concession was dangerous to the Pope, besides which there was no little fear of disorder in England, where the sound instincts of the people were all for Catherine and passionately against her rival. An unpopular war with Charles was plainly in the air, for Henry had sent him a defiance on hearing of the sack of Rome, and had forced Wolsey once more to transfer the English staple to Calais. All this threw trade into still further disorder, and that just at a time when several harvests had been bad. The cloths of Essex, Kent, Wiltshire, Suffolk, and other counties found no sale. Formidable disturbances again arose in Kent, the rioters declaring that they would seize the cardinal and place him on the sea in a leaky boat. The continued suppression of small monasteries had added to his unpopularity, as had also the search which he had ordered for Lutheran books, nor was he held in high favour even with Henry himself, having offended him apparently through inadvertence with regard to a trifling appointment in which Anne Boleyn was interested. There was also difficulty in finding an opportunity of justifying himself, since Henry, in alarm at finding Anne attacked with the sweating sickness, was hurrying from one house to another in unkingly fear for his own safety. On arriving in London, October 17th, 1528, Campeggio discussed a proposal that the Queen should retire to a religious house on condition that if no son was born from any other marriage, her daughter should succeed to the throne. But Catherine would not hear of the arrangement. He then intimated that he must report to the Pope before he judged the case. In fact, he was being constantly urged by no means to omit this, as the Emperor was advancing on Italy, and a false step might be ruinous. Meanwhile, Catherine's enemies were plotting against her in many ways. Her Flemish advocates were ordered to leave the kingdom before the trial. She was accused of popularizing herself and thus causing conspiracies against her husband. Attempts were made to get away from her a paper most important to her cause. It was threatened that her daughter should not be allowed to see her, and Mary's establishment was broken up on pretence of economy, while Anne was brought to live in the palace. All the time, Campeggio did not tell even Wolsey what his commission from the Pope really was, but as this reserve was not generally known, delays were attributed to the minister, and his power began to crumble under him. Things got still worse when 7 months passed without any step being taken toward a decision. At length the case took a more definite shape, for Charles, being manifestly resolved on supporting his aunt to the uttermost, the Pope was obliged to receive Catherine's protest against her judges, and determined on revoking the cause, that is, on reserving it for his own consideration. It therefore became an object for the promoters of the divorce to get the legatine court held in London before the revocation arrived, and it was opened on the 21st of June, 1529. At this session the well-known scene took place. The Queen knelt at Henry's feet, besought him to have pity on her as a poor woman and a stranger born out of his dominions, and urged him to consider her own honour and her daughter's, and that of the Spanish nation and her relatives. Finally, she informed him and the assembly that she had appealed directly to the Pope, before whom it was only reasonable that the cause should be decided without partiality or suspicion. To Rome only would she make her answer. She then left the room, and being thrice summoned in vain to return, was declared contumacious. The next sessions of the court were for taking evidence. On the 28th, the aged Bishop Fisher, the faithful servant of Henry's family for 3 generations, appeared to maintain that Catherine's marriage was indissoluble, seeing that every defect in its legality had been made good by dispensations which the Pope was perfectly competent to give. He ended by putting in for the information of the court a book which he had written on the subject. Great was the astonishment at this act of boldness, and at the fervour and eloquence with which the old man pressed his view. The judges replied lamely enough that it was not his business to pronounce so decidedly on the cause, as it had not been committed to him, but Henry himself made up for all deficiencies by a reply still extant, which bears unquestionable marks of the royal style. "I never thought, judges," says this document, "to see the Bishop of Rochester taking upon himself the task of accusing me before your tribunal, an accusation more befitting the malice of a disaffected subject and the unruly passions of a seditious mob than the character and station of a bishop. Why has he kept silence for so many months, and then declared his opinion thus unseasonably? It would have been more dutiful to begin by private admonition, and thus avoid discrediting both the king, who is pressing for the divorce, and the Pope, who has been entertaining the question. And what need was there to talk of maintaining the truth even to the fire, as if any harsh measures had ever been taken, or were likely to be taken, against the Queen's defenders?" End of section 15.